أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والشمس وبناها والقمر إذا تلاها والنهار إذا جلاها والليل إذا يغشاها والسماء وما بناها والأرض وما طحاها ونفس وما سواها فألهمها فجورها وتقواها. قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها. كذبت ثمود بتغواها إذ انبعث أشقاها فقال لهم رسول الله ناقة الله وسقياها فكذبوه فعقروها فدمدم عليهم ربهم بذنبهم فسواها ولا يخاف عقباها. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. We're now very fortunate to have Shaykh Kumail Rajani, who will be speaking to us on Hadith, statements of Imams, or cultural memory of early Shias. Let's welcome him. Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Shaykh Kumail is a well-renowned scholar who is known to us in our community. We're very fortunate to have him, and he's at Exeter University and a lecturer in Islamic studies. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Sisters and brothers, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So the topic which I've selected to present today is on Hadith. Whether Hadiths are statements of the Imams or collective memory of the Shiite community. The questions which I'm interested to discuss with you today is about the Hadith and how we perceive Hadith. When we discuss the topic of Hadith, the first thing which comes to our mind is whether Hadith or Ahadith are the exact statements of Imams or not. What community would perceive is when I say Imam Sadiq ﷺ has said something, the impression is that these are the utterances and the exact statements of the Imams. And we would like to dig a bit deeper whether Hadith or Ahadith are the exact utterances of the Imams or something else. In this session, by no means, I'm not downplaying the role of Hadith. There is no such intention to belittle Hadith or the role it plays in our day-to-day lives. But the intention is to find its appropriate place and get a total appreciation, a holistic appreciation of Hadith literature. So it might be perceived something like, well, if Hadith have some challenges, so it might not be as standard as something which we Muslims should be taking into consideration as far as our legal or theological or Quranic approaches are concerned. That's not what I'm trying to do. I want to bring some challenges and discuss some challenges in order to find the exact position of Hadith and get a holistic appreciation of this literature. So, very basic stuff. I'm sure we all are familiar with it. But just to recap, what is Hadith? When we say Hadith, Hadith is different from Sunnah. So, Sunnah is what Prophet has said, what Prophet had acted upon, or like he has acted, or his tacit approvals. We Shias believe if something is said from, we have received from Imam, so if Imam has said something, or Imam has performed something, or the tacit approvals are part and parcel of the same Sunnah. When it comes to Hadith, Hadith are reports of those sayings. We don't have access to the direct sayings and the actions of the Prophet, right? So we don't have direct access to Sunnah. This Sunnah, when it gets transmitted, when it gets reported, we could call that as Hadith. So Hadiths are basically reports of the Sunnah. There are two components of Hadith. One is Isnad and the other is Matn. Isnad is the chain of transmission. Matn is a text, right? Content of the hadith. So any hadith, usually when we receive a WhatsApp on a particular hadith, what would happen is we would get the content, the matn, the text, right? We don't receive the isnad because we are less interested in the chains of transmission. Actually, when it comes to hadith, hadith is the full package, both the components together, right? So if I report something from Al-Kafi by Shaykh Al-Kulaini, it would go this way. Ali bin Ibrahim, who is Kulaini's teacher, he would report from his dad, Ibrahim bin Hashim. He would report from Nawfali, Ismail bin Nawfali, Hussein bin Yazid and Nawfali. He would report from another person whose name is Sakuni, Ismail bin Abi Ziyad Sakuni. And that person would report from Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. So this is a chain of transmission, which we may call it isnad, right? That's the first part of the hadith. And the second part, which presumably we are more interested, is the content of the hadith, right? That Imam has said so and so. So this component, both the components make a complete hadith. This was just an introduction. Now let's delve into the main aspect, main issues which I would like to discuss with you today. So there are areas of scholarly interest as far as hadith literature is concerned. I'm sure we all would have different angles and different dimensions as far as hadith literature is concerned. But what is discussed in secondary literature are these questions. Number one, the question of authenticity, the question of credibility, whether a particular report, a particular hadith has reached down to us through appropriate means, whether Imam has said this or not, whether we would be able to attribute a particular report to Imam or not. These are the questions as far as authenticity is concerned. The second question could be the question of transmission, right? Let's say Imam has said something, how it has been transmitted to later generations, right? So that's the question of transmission. The third question is the question of compilation. So we would have Imam has said something to his companions. These companions have reported to other people who have compiled in a form of a book, in a form of a collection, right? That's the question of compilation. Traveling and migration and the reception of hadith. When this hadith would have spoken by Imam, would have uttered by Imam in Medina, this would go to Kufa because the Shiite early community used to exist and live in Kufa. From Kufa, it would travel to Baghdad, or it may travel to Qom, or it may travel to North Africa in Fatimid state, right? So these are the areas of traveling and reception of hadith in different lands and different places and regions. The last question would be, an area of research is the area of arrangement. How these hadiths have been situated and arranged in secondary literature, in larger collections, right? I'm just citing bullet point. We would be discussing in detail each one of them or most of them. Let me give you an example of how all these areas of interest would be located. And feel free to just shout out if you are interested in any particular area. I won't be disturbed, I won't be bothered. So please feel free. I would be more than happy to receive your questions while I'm speaking. So as far as these questions are concerned, questions of authenticity, transmission, compilation, traveling and arrangement, this would be a typical example where Imams have uttered something. All right, it will go down to companions. Companions are those people who lived with Imams, his friends, his associates, his students, his disciples, whatever we may want to call. This first generation of the companions were not those people who used to write. And that's a critical aspect we can't afford to neglect. Right? So the companions of the Imams are not the authors, are not the collectors in a form of books. They are auditing, they are listening to what Imam said, and they would be in future reporting back to their fellow companions. But in this stage, we don't have written documents. Predominantly, you would always find here and there couple of writings, but predominantly at this stage, we don't have much writing, so to speak. The third aspect would be the aspect or the dimension of transmitters and compilers. In the third stage, we have scholars, we have companions or transmitters, you may call them. They are those people who would start writing in a form of books, in a form of larger collections. And this is the area which Shiite community would be distinct from the Sunni community, because in Sunni communities, as far as this period is concerned, the second generation at the time of the Imams, they were not busy, they were not writing. We don't have much work from them as far as written tradition is concerned. Shiite community were distinct in terms of writing hadith at this level, at this period. This would later on go to the fourth stage, where I have mentioned smaller or medium collections. Now we have scholars sitting in Qom, right? Likes of Ahmad bin Muhammad bin Isa al-Ashari, a giant scholar in the 3rd century after Hijrah, 9th century Common Era. He would be someone who would collect all those hadiths which have received from Kufa, and presumably Kufans have received from Medina, in medium collections, you may call it smaller collections. So that would be the 4th stage. And the 5th stage would become larger collections. So the books in today's world which we have access to, these are larger collections, right? We all are familiar with Al-Kafi of Al-Kulaini. That's a larger collection, but that reaches to the 5th stage. Or we are familiar with Man La Yahdur al-Faqih of Shaykh Saduq, right? That comes at the 5th stage. So before that, what we see in like hadith literature, it has gone to 4 early stages, which each of it has its own challenges, right? It has its own areas of discussions which we may want to mention. Just to give you an example, this is a famous chain, Al-Kafi. This chain occurs like 500 times in Al-Kulaini's Al-Kafi. It's a famous, we have some couple of Sunnis in the transmission as well. So we have Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. He is issuing, or he is discussing couple of issues with Ismail bin Abi Ziyad al-Sakuni. So Sakuni is a Sunni transmitter who used to be a companion of Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. So Sakuni is a transmitter who reports to his fellow companion, whose name is Hussein bin Yazid al-Nawfali. He would, and this two are in Kufa. Later on it gets to Qom through Ibrahim bin Hashim, and he reports to his own son Ali bin Ibrahim, and that comes to Al-Kulaini al-Kafi, right? So these are like, 5 stages which may be interested in looking into deeper. Another famous transmission, chain of transmission would be Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. He would issue some statement to Zurara. I'm sure we all are familiar with Zurara, like, the most cited authority as far as the companions of Imams are concerned. He would report something to Harith bin Abdullah Sijistani. Harith is the person who writes a book, who collects the reports of the Imam. So Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam is not an author of any book. Zurara, his own companion, is not an author or a collector of reports. At the 3rd stage, which is Harith bin Abdullah Sijistani, he is the person who collects the book, who collects this report in a compilation. And then we have Ibrahim bin Hashim coming from Kufa to Qom, and then we have Ali bin Ibrahim reporting to Kulaini. I've introduced what is hadith, I've introduced how the hadith work, I've introduced different stages. Now let's discuss challenges. The first challenge which usually is discussed is about authenticity. Everyone is interested in whenever there is hadith, whether this hadith is sahih or not, whether this is authentic or not. You are just citing it, right? So the question of authenticity pops up in every conversation, in every discussions, right? People are obsessed with the question of authenticity. And rightfully so, because it's an important question. I would like to dissect the question of authenticity and the discussions pertaining to the question of authenticity at 2 levels. Within the tradition, there might be one response to the question of authenticity. outside the tradition, people might look things differently. And let's look from these two dimensions. So within the tradition, like Shia community or Muslim community in large, what would happen is the question of authenticity would be resolved by chains of transmissions, right? By isnad. Someone would come and say, oh, the isnad which we just saw, this is an excellent isnad. All the transmitters, all the people occurring in the isnad are trustworthy, are like thiqa, and for that reason, this hadith is exactly what Imam Sadiq would have said. That's how, within the tradition, people would resolve the question of authenticity. Whereas out of a tradition, outside the tradition, there is a lot of skepticism. And why there is a skepticism? For the very reason I just mentioned, because there are 5 stages between Shaykh Kulainis al-Kafi, which you could see, which you have direct access to, is different, or it might be different from what Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam would have said, because there is a gap of 5 different stages, right? So there is a question of skepticism, whether this hadith which occurs in Kulaini, whether we would be able to attribute to Imam Sadiq or not. That's the question which outside the tradition scholars would be interested in. The thing is, either you take it or throw it. You can't do more than that. I want to advocate a middle path, which is not to take it fully, not to throw it fully as well, but to work with it, but to engage with it, because it certainly contains a lot of nuggets, a lot of beautiful things which we'll be discussing. Orientalists, those people who are non-Muslims, those people I would call outside the tradition. I was debating with myself either to choose the word Orientalism. It has always a connotation of mischiefs. So I purposefully avoided the word Orientalist. I wanted to choose the word non-Muslim, but then even Muslims would have the angle which non-Muslims would have, right? So for that reason, I didn't choose that word. I wanted to mention Western scholars as well, but then I don't believe the difference between Western and Eastern scholars, because the boundaries are blurred nowadays. Eastern scholars might have perspective which Western scholars might not have, and Western scholars might have something which is... So I was debating with this word, and I finally came to this within the tradition, outside the tradition. What I mean is people who are committed to a particular faith or people who are not committed to the particular faith. But thank you so much for highlighting it. So outside the tradition, let's see why there is a skepticism. So as I said, within the fold of outside the tradition, we can't paint the wall with one brush, because there are in a spectrum, there are varieties of the opinion, because there is a tendency always to say, okay, Orientalists, like Western scholars, people outside the tradition, so they might not get the right understanding which we people have access to, or we have an insight which they might not have to. To be absolutely clear, outside the tradition, people fall in a variety of opinion. You would see outside the tradition people who are skeptics. Outside the tradition, you would find people who are sanguine. They would be wholeheartedly accept hadith as a point of reference, as an interesting literature to work with it, right? So always scholars are not skeptics, who are non-Muslim, they are not skeptics. They might be interested in what is going on in hadith as well. So those who are skeptics, the issues are of forgery. So number one thing would come to mind is within the hadith literature, there are issues which are forged, right? There are issues which have been debated in earlier communities, and people, because they wanted to advance their cause, they have forged certain things. And we have report, some of the scholars or early transmitters have forged reports in order to increase the level of piety of the communities. Right? So one person was saying well, people are reading less Quran, let's encourage, incentivize people to read Quran through hadith. Right? Prophet has said something, this is there in the report. So this is a level of forgery, right? So that's one thing when it comes to skepticism, or the reasons why people are skeptic as far as hadith literature is concerned. The second question would be the question of back projection as far as the question of authenticity is concerned. So how it will work? Skeptics would come up with the idea of back projection. They would say, like, we see within the literature that there are hadith reported, but that hadith they came later and the fiqh opinion came earlier. So let me expand a little bit. Early Muslim communities were debating, early Shiite communities were debating within themselves. In order to advance the opinion of one scholar over the other scholar, one might forge a hadith because they want to advance their own point of interest, right? So that's back projection. So back projection is like you make a hadith referring back to the opinion which is been debated in order to advance your opinion. Am I making sense here? The point of back projection? Okay, so in early period, like, whether you put for a wudu, you put water from this side or this side, right? There's a ongoing debate within the scholars or like early companions where a person should make a wudu. So in order to advance the cause of scholar A, whose opinion is to put wudu from here, they would come with a hadith. They would say, like, I heard this from an imam who has said this and that. Right? The hadith has came into existence much later than the opinion, because in early stage we see there was a dispute among the scholars, right? Hadith is coming into existence in the 3rd century when imams have already passed, right? So you make a hadith in order to advance the cause which was disputed in earlier stage. Is that big? The hadith is forgery. That's right, yeah. Dating hadith, I'm not talking about any dating website. What I mean by dating is dating the source, dating the history. And I'm reminded by what Professor Asaria had recommended me a book by E.H. Carr, What is History? Fantastic work. That would give us an insight about like looking at these questions about, historicity, dating the sources with outside the tradition. Scholars are interested. For us, it would be a matter of belief, right? We won't go through all those stages, but outside the tradition, people would be interested in each of these sections one by one. And there could be many other aspects. In my doctoral thesis, I introduced another approach of the question of authenticity. I know a question of authenticity is like a boring question, but let me expand on what I have advanced as far as the question of authenticity is concerned. So I make an introduction from the first authority, who is Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, and then you have 2 transmitters in 2 different parts of the world, right, at the time of Imam. So narrator A is in Medina, which you could see on my right side, and narrator X in Medina or Kufa, right? Then you have transmitter B in Egypt, you have transmitter Y in Kufa, then you have compiler C in Qayrawan, compiler Z in Qom. Let me start from the bottom. So compiler C in Qayrawan is Qadi Noman, who is an Ismaili scholar, right? So in his book, which we have access, he has mentioned a hadith. On compiler Z in Qom is our Kulaini, Shaykh al-Kulaini, right? We have access to his book. Kulaini writes his book in Kufa. Qadi Noman writes his book in Qayrawan in North Africa. So in 2 different parts of the world, right? They exist in the same period. Both of them are living at the same period, living in 2 different regions, but narrating the same thing. What it would say, that they have got access to it from an earlier period, right? Because there was no option for them to meet together and, they discuss and copy from each other because they are living in 2 different parts of the world, right? Citing same thing. So by this thing, you would be able to advance the cause, like, people at different places citing the same thing, it means they have access to same sources, right? So if you write a one page, like, an essay, and someone, like in Pakistan, would write the same essay in one page, one would come to the conclusion like both of you have access to a common source, right? That common source could go to the time of Imam in Kufa. I don't want to delve deeper, but if there is an interest, we could further discuss in question answer. Yes, please. Yes.
So from the first authority to the transmitter, how many years would it pass, perhaps?
The first authority to the narrator or compiler?
From the first authority to the transmitter. So who is the first person who is writing?
Yes, this is an example. So I'm giving with the dates in this example, right? So Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, he had two students. One is Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salatu wasalam, his own son, Medina. And Ismail bin Abi Ziyad al-Sakuni, who is again in Medina. So they both met Imam and they have received from Imam. Yeah. Musa bin Ja'far al-Kadhim, Imam al-Kadhim, one of his students, whose name is Ismail bin Musa bin Ja'far, he travels to Egypt after having heard hadith from Imam al-Kadhim. From here, Ismail bin Abi Ziyad al-Sakuni, his students, who is Ibrahim bin Hashim al-Qumi, through different chains, reaches to Kufa. Right? From Egypt, it goes to Qayrawan. From Kufa, it goes to Qum. As far as dates are concerned, the first two are the disciples, so they existed at the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam died in 148 after Hijrah. Then we have Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam without any gap, right? In the second, Medina to Kufa, there is a gap because we have a student between them who is Hussein bin Yazid al-Nawfali, right? Which I haven't mentioned over here. From Egypt to Qayrawan, again there is a gap of like almost 70 years. In Kufa to Qum, there is another gap of almost 70 years. So this is how the timeline would.
So it's a question of memory as well.
Excellent question. We are going to come back to this about like paraphrasing of the content of hadith. That is something I would draw your attention at that stage. Yeah. Any other question? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for bringing that excellent point. So just a recap, we're discussing what is hadith, and then after we discussed about the introduction of hadith, I said there are areas of scholarly interest from authenticity to transmission to compilation to traveling and reception, and then arrangement. I think we have covered most of transmission, compilation, and traveling journey. The point of arrangement, that is something which I would like to highlight through an example. This is what we're discussing about the memory, right? So there is a concept which is naql bil mana. So in the very first slide, I said like whether there is the hadiths are exact statements and utterances of the Imam. Not really, simply for the fact because a lot of stuff have been transmitted through a technique which is called naql bil ma'na. And I've just translated paraphrasing, right? So if I say something, you would paraphrase my own words and hopefully more articulately, you would tell to your fellow sisters and brothers, right? So the content would remain the same, inshallah. But the words would be different. The articulation would be different, right? So that's what is occurring a lot in hadith literature. So Imam have said something that have been paraphrased in a different style. Now, there's nothing to be worried about this because people had this issue and they asked Imams. In Al-Kafi, there are reports, people came, oh, we can't memorize the full statements. We don't know, the full statement which you have issued. And Imams have given permission in those reports that as long as you remain committed to the content, that should be fine, which is called naql bil ma'na, and naql bil ma'na, which is paraphrasing. So that is something which is occurring. Contextual evidence, that doesn't come in the report, right? Unless in couple of reports. Otherwise, you would lose the context, circumstantial evidences which are there with the companions had access to, right? So companions would understand the statements of Imam, but the compilers later on, they won't because there is a gap of generations. splitting the text, there is another challenge where there would be a single lengthy report. It would be dissected, it would be cut into pieces, relocated in different places. And now I want to share that issue with you. So, one single report, how it is dissected and put into different places in a book. If you recall, I had mentioned the fifth was arrangement, right? What I mean by arrangement is the way hadiths are arranged at different places. That is very interesting to look, right? That's the example which I want to give. So, just bear with me. I'm going to read sections from Al-Kafi of Kulaini from 4 different places, and then you tell me. I'm going to ask you and you tell me what's happening over here. So my job now onwards is just like, a transmitter. I would like to seek your opinion of what you would be thinking. So number 1, Al-Kafi, volume 6, page number 448, 449. Al-Hasan al-Zayyat al-Basri. He's a transmitter, yeah? He reports. Thank you so much. He reports, my friend and I visited Abu Ja'far al-Imam al-Sadiq. We were surprised to see him in a glamorous house. He was wearing a dyed robe, colorful robe. Wardiya. Its color was yellow or rose, pinkish. He had his beard trimmed. He had applied kohol, right? Something which Arabs apply. We asked him few questions. And when we finished, he addressed to me saying, "O Hassan, return to me tomorrow, you and your friend." I replied, "Sure, my life be ransom for you." I visited him next day, and I was astonished to see him in a house which had nothing but a humble mat. He was wearing a dull top. Addressing to my friend, Imam said, "O Basran, when you visited me yesterday, I was in my wife's home." Imam was lucky to have a wife who had a glamorous home. Yesterday it was her day. The house was hers and the belongings were hers. She put up her makeup with the condition, I did this translation on trace, so sorry for that. With the condition that I also get dressed up. Doubt should not prevail your mind. My friend said to the Imam, "My life be ransom on you. By God, doubt did occur to me. But now I swear God has removed my doubt, and I know for sure," it didn't come up the slide, but I know for sure what you said was the truth. That's the first passage in volume 6, which I mentioned. The second passage in another chapter, I forgot to mention. The previous what I read, that was in the chapter. Kulaini had named the chapter as wearing yellow garment, right? Lubsul muasfar, like wearing a garment which is yellow. And for that reason, I said dyed, which might be of a yellow color. Second place where Kafi mentions with the same isnad. Now we all are familiar how isnad works, from the same chain of transmission, nothing different. In the chapter of beard and mustache, there's a chapter in Kafi, Ashari wal Lahya. Al-Hasan al-Zayyat al-Basri reports, I saw Abu Ja'far and he had his beard trimmed. That's it. That's what Kulaini mentions. In another place of Al-Kafi, Kulaini mentions, Al-Hasan al-Zayyat al-Basri reports, I visited Abu Ja'far Imam al-Baqir in a glamorous house. And then I returned the next day, and he was in a house that had nothing but a humble mat. And he had a dull top. Imam said, the house which you saw yesterday was not my house, it was my wife's house. Yesterday was her day. That's it. Not more than that. At the fourth place, the chapter, Al-Kafi, volume 6, page 375, the chapter is garlic. The name of the chapter, Athum, garlic. Al-Hasan al-Zayyat reports, when I completed my Hajj rituals, I passed through Medina. I inquired Abu Ja'far al-Imam al-Baqir. Someone told me that the Imam was in Yambo. I left for Yambo. When Imam saw me, he said, "Oh Hassan, you came all the way till here to visit me?" I said, "My soul be ransom on you. I could not leave without seeing you." Imam alayhi salam said, I had garlic, in eating, right? So I had garlic, I ate garlic, and so I wanted to stay away from the mosque of the Prophet. By the way, Yambo is a place in the outskirts of Medina, right? So Imam was not in Medina, in the outskirts of Medina. Well, as I said, my job was just to transmit 4 places in which Kafi mentions this. So what is your impression? What's happening over here?
Don't eat garlic. Don't eat garlic.
Oh, don't eat garlic? Well, to eat garlic and go in the outskirts of London. So what Kumail is doing here, I mean, by
It's okay to trim beard and mustache.
okay, that's one point which Kumail certainly puts a section in, like, you know, in that, yeah.
You have to give your wife different time if you have more than one.
Excellent, like, you know, you had time, but this condition was doji, like if you had time, you have to get time for your wives, yeah. Excellent. Yeah, if you have garlic, you should be staying away from public spaces. Excellent.
But surely the idea is, why does Kuleni split it into 4 or 5 different sections in different bars?
Yeah, that's the crux of the matter which I want to highlight, where I appreciate, like, you know, we are interested in content, but the point of focus here is, like, you know, the hadith which we may think of a statement of Imam, or, like, you know, an incident which occurred. As I said, the context is lost, the context is not reported, it is dissected in different places. Let's say you are reading just, like, you know, about, you are interested in reading about garlic, you would miss the whole picture what was there, right? Because a particular hadith is being dissected across the book, right? So that's a big challenge. And for that reason, what I was saying, like, you know, something what you receive in WhatsApp, through WhatsApp, it might be part of something, a larger picture, which we might be missing. Not to mention, there might be many other things which we might be missing, which is not recorded in the report in the first place. And here you go, there is a composite structure of the report, which I haven't translated because this is a composite. Like, you know, everything is in place. This person goes, meets Imam. Imam is asking, why you out? Garlic. Then, you know, the house is like glamorous. Next day, come back, he visits, Imam explains and everything in a composite manner. But that's not in Al-Kafi. That's in another book, which you might not be interested in reading it.
The interesting thing is that the wife owned quite a lot of stuff. That tells us that at that time the women could have lots of things while the man wasn't rich.
That's an interesting take from the hadith as well. Lot of things could be, you know, derived from this as far as content is concerned, and as far as, like, you know, the composite or dissected structure is concerned. By highlighting this example, what I wanted to mention is, these are the challenges scholars would face in reading hadith and hadith literature. To make it more complex and to double the problem and the challenges which we face is this one. Now you tell me, that hadith was from Hasan al-Zayyat al-Basri, right? Here you have completely a different picture. Muhammad bin Yahya, Kumail's teacher, who is Muhammad bin Yahya al-Attar, he takes this from Ahmad bin Muhammad bin Isa al-Ashari, who is, like, you know, giant scholar. Ali bin Hakam. Let's not get into that. Al-Hakam bin Utayba, and this Hakam bin Utayba says, and I'm just translating, that I arrived, I visited Imam Bakr Isam, he was in a glamorous house, he had nothing, I mean, he had, like, you know, fresh clothes, a dyed color cloth, robe. I started looking at, like, the belongings of the house, and Imam said, "Oh Hakam, what do you say about, like, you know, my lifestyle?" He said, "Asaitu an aqul wa ana arahu alayk amma indana fa innama yaf'alu shab al-murhi." In our community, in our tradition, only, like, you know, young people do this kind of things, right? Like coal and, like, you know, glamorous and, like, colorful clothes and everything. We don't see, like, an old person such as yours, and, like, at the position of which you hold as a scholar, you would do it. Like, in our community, only Shabul Murek. Shabul Murek is a young person who has just, like, you know, started growing beard. Faqal Ali, and Imam said, "Oh Hakam, man harrama zinat Allah allati akhraj al ibad." Imam is citing the verse, like, you know, who is forbidding enjoying all the beauty which God has given. Now, وَهَذَا مِمَّا أَخْرَجَ اللَّهُ لِعِبَادِهِ فَأَمَّا هَذَا الْبَيْتِ, the house which you see, that was the house of the wife, mar'a, وَأَنَا قَرِيبُ الْعَهْدِ بِالْعُرْسِ. I'm like, I've just recently married. وَبَيْتِي الْبَيْتُ الَّذِي تَعْرِفُ, right? My actual house is the house which I live in, right? This is my wife's house. So, is there like two different people say having the same experience with the Imam? Or there is some issue going on like Hasan al-Zayyat al-Basri and there is a confusion with this, right? So, I don't think I would be discussing this slide towards the end because I'm sure we want to have some question answer as well. Let's not miss, to conclude, I would say, Hadith, we may want to look, at least I am proposing, right? You may have a different opinion, but I'm at least proposing to start looking at Hadith as a repository of early discourses and debates of the then Shi'i community as opposed to the statements and utterance of the Imams, right? Because there are a lot of contradictions, there are a lot of challenges, and there you see the problem. People outside the tradition, if we don't come up with this, discussions, what would happen is like, scholars outside the tradition, they are going to come up with these researches, right? So there should be people within the communities, within the tradition, who should be highlighting these issues so we get a proper appreciation where we stand vis-a-vis Hadith is concerned, right? So Hadith is an excellent source. And I'm not advocating like all Hadith are not the statements of Imam. In the pool of Hadith literature or the pool of Hadith material which we have at our disposal, there should be reports of the Imams, certainly, right? But not all the Hadith would be the utterances of the Imam, right? So we may want to look at like repository of all the discussions and all the tensions and all the debates and interesting stuff going on in that community. It would give a cultural aspect of the early Shi'i community. In the slide I had earlier thought like cultural memory, and then I changed like to collective memory, but you may call it cultural or collective memory. Imam and companion relationship, that's a good angle to look at Hadith, like how Imams were in touch with their companions and how discussions were there. People had doubts as far as like Imam's position is concerned. Imam had to clarify their position, so on and so forth. Inter and intra-Shia discourses we may find in a lot of Hadith. Travel history is something we might be interested. This Basran fellow is coming to Kufa. He's traveling to Mecca, presumably for Hajj, but he comes to Medina to visit Imam, and so on and so forth. These are different angles which we may want to look. As I said, by no means I want to downplay the role of Hadith. By no means I want to give that impression that Hadith is not an important source. I think Hadith is one of the most valuable resource or point of reference as far as we are concerned. The angle which I want to say is like, let's not attribute everything to the Imams, because what we have received are not necessarily the statements and the utterances of the Imams. It could be from a broad variety of angle and dimensions which we have just clarified and discussed in this lecture. Thank you for your attention. We could have some questions.
Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Just a quick note, if you do have children in the other hall, please do pick them up, and please bring them here if you'd like, just right now, so as we're going to be closing up the children's program next door. Any questions from either side? You have lots of time for questions.
If we contrast this aspect with the collection of the Quran, you see a completely different. Their textual authenticity is the central point. This one reminds me of the collection of the Bible. If you're familiar with that discussion, that this is exactly paraphrasing the discourse around Isa alayhi salam. It's not the exact words of Isa, but different gospels, different things are trying to put together. I think if we take it in that spirit, it doesn't lose authenticity in that sense, but it doesn't become sacrosanct. I think that's where I want to draw the thing.
Excellent summary, excellent. I very nicely and profoundly put. So yeah, like, you know, Mark, Luke, Matthew, like when you have different sort of angle to the life of Jesus, that would give us an insight of, like, you know, how they perceived, how they understood, and what's the relation with Jesus is concerned, but not necessarily as a companionship, because not all of them were companions, but how they have received the material. And we may want to look at Talmud as well, right? Like how the two biblical sort of Mishnah and Midrash, how they would differ in terms of when it comes to the reporting of the Jewish tradition, right? So that's an interesting looking as well.
So a very side question. So if Iqbal Bhai said that one is the word of God and one is sort of a relay of the words of a prophet. So what are we meant to do? Why is it, and there's a very topical discussion at the moment about marja. What do we follow? What do we do? Do we have to follow the Bible or the Hadith? And it is the Hadith from where our marja get their information. I mean, that's in my, in my knowledge at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. As far as the Hadith is concerned, as I said, like, you know, the intention is not to downplay, which you already highlighted. So we could work with it, right? As I said, like, there are people who say either you could work with it, either you take it or throw it, right? So that's not the approach we should be taking, in my humble opinion, and I don't take that approach. What I would do is like to work with it, right? When I say to work with it, is to identify all these things which I'm sure our scholars are not unaware of, right? They do in their ilmul rijal and, you know, their ayatul hadith, they go through all this, like, you know, sophistication. So the assumption is the scholars are aware of the intricacies and like sophistication of this material. They know how to work with this, right? And presumably they work with this material and they come to a sound conclusion. So that's what scholars would be doing. And as far as like following marja or not following marja, that's like, you know, shared community has always accepted this tradition as part of, like, you know, but akhbaris, they don't follow marja. Akhbaris would very much, like, you know, they would stick to the reports of the Imams, and they believe these are like utterances of the Imams. So I'm sure there might be scholars who would come with this, like, we could still work with this, we could use them as point of references, but not to the level of like Quran. And for that reason, if the hadith does not match with the content of the Quran, you may want to explore different point of references as far as your legal derivation is concerned, right? So hadith would take a secondary level, a secondary category of the point of reference, not the first category of the reference. But if we don't take this into consideration and consider like Quran and hadith at a parallel level, that's where the problem would start. Right? That's really genuinely a problem, because we know the issues are complex, right? It's not that straightforward because of the issues which we just discussed.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for that lecture. You know, when we talk about hadith or this perception of hadith being sacrosanct, at what point did it become so heavy in our understanding of faith, and what historical setting or what led to that? almost equality with the Quran and within our religious thinking?
Excellent question. Thank you for bringing this up. I should have included in my presentations, but there's an oversight. So thank you for bringing this an excellent question because it advances the argument which I'm presenting. So in early stages, there were scholars who did not adhere or they were not committed to accept the hadith as something which should be taken into consideration seriously. The name is Sayyid Murtaza, for example, right? Sayyid Murtaza is a Baghdadi scholar soon after minor occultation, soon after 329 Imam after Hijrah, Imam goes into Al-Ghaibatul Kubra, the major occultation, and then comes scholars like Sheikh Mufid and Sayyid Murtaza, his student, right? So we are talking about early 5th century. Scholars who did not adhere to reports which were called al-akhbarul ahad, reports which were cited on an individual basis, like chains of transmission which were singular. So if a report had been transmitted from multiple channels throughout the ages and history, right, in each generation we had 15, 20, 25, 30 scholars mentioning it, then those scholars would say we would put faith on it, because in every generation we have successive generation we have numbers of scholars citing it. Sayyid Murtaza said there are a bunch of reports which are cited on a singular transmissions, like one person. He said I can't put my faith on it, and he did not adhere to those reports. So what I'm trying to say, that your question is very valid. In early stages, like after Al-Ghaibatul Kubra, scholars were not necessarily ready in terms of accepting each and every report. Having said that, there were scholars who started accepting everything, but at least the dispute was there, right? In Sunni tradition, problem is same, that they won't accept singular tradition. Famously, when Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i, the Mazhab al-Shafi'i is named after Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i. He is the one who started saying when Quran says al-kitab wal-hikmah, it means Quran and Hadith. That's an exegetical intervention, right? Early scholars were not understanding al-kitab wal-hikmah in terms of Quran and Hadith. That being equated after Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i. That's in Sunni tradition, and as I mentioned, Shiite tradition as well. That's early period. Let's come to what we may call it late classical period, right? Likes of Allama Hilli, Muhakkik Hilli, and the other scholars who were residing in Hilla. As far as Shi'i history is concerned, we know the four Nuwab of Imam, they were residing in Baghdad. So scholars were in Baghdad. Sheikh Mufid, Sayyid Murtaza, Sheikh Saduq has traveled there as well. Sheikh Tusi was there, but later on it came to Hilla. Before Hilla, Sheikh Tusi is another interesting personality who brings hadith into forefront, right? That hadith should be taken seriously. So in Sunni world, you have Shafi taking this position. In Shi'i world, Sheikh Tusi is the individual where you see turning point. I won't say I won't hold him responsible, but it's a major turning point. When it comes to Hilla, it becomes more and more acceptable.
The time between Sheikh al-Hilli and Shafi and Tusi, I'm assuming there is
more than 200 years. Yeah. Sheikh Tusi died in 460 after Hijrah. So 5th century. In the second half of the 6th century. 5th century. Yeah. Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i, 3rd century. So almost 200 years.
Thank you, Sheikh, for your... thank you. I just wanted to add, so, I mean, I obviously respect the work that you've done in your PhD and the thesis and everything, but I think there are some fundamental flaws, and I think it's quite dangerous, some of what's been said. I mean, for example, this question about the period, of time that was the lapse. I mean, we could argue the same argument for Hadith al-Thaqalain. You know, the connection between the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. Now, we're not equating Hadith with the Quran. I think anybody would do that. But I think the slippery slope here is where we start to say, well, we're only going to rely on the Quran. And we've seen problems in that throughout the centuries, in different schools, as you well know. So I think there has to be a balance, especially when we're considering that effectively what we're saying is that Maraja have actually hidden the fact that we shouldn't be relying on any hadith, which is effectively what you're saying. What you're saying is that they know that hadith are not truthful, or some of them are not truthful. Many of them, as you've actually said, are not truthful, but they're actually hiding it from their followers. Now, obviously, they study, and I'm sure much of what's said can be debated, does get debated in Hawza. But I think it starts to get dangerous when you say the entire of the Shia ulama are starting to hide these things, perhaps. Hadith was effectively a novel creation, which we know is not true, and that we shouldn't be relying on it at all. It goes into the fact, well, how on earth can you, especially if you're not an Arabic speaker, how on earth can you read an English Quran and interpret it without relying on any of the hadith? I'm sorry, it's fundamentally not possible. So I respect what you've said, and I respect your thesis and your research, and no doubt you've done a huge amount. But I think it's quite difficult in what's been 45 minutes to cover this whole topic without raising serious doubts, and for members of the community to go away, start doubting their own faith, doubting their own scholars, and even some of the hadith, all the way back to Hadith al-Thaqalain, where I think the Prophet was quite clear. So anyway, just thought to raise the alternate view.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. Thank you for bringing this. First of all, I'm surprised, because the thing is like, did I give this impression? I need to have another 45 minutes of lecture if I gave this impression that hadith is not a... Sorry?
That's why there needs to be great care in the argument, because if it's a very brisk thing where lots of...
Yeah, no, I want to unpack. Sure, I want to unpack, but before that, let me receive the feedback. Did I give this impression that hadith is not a valuable source and like it should be thrown out, only relying on Quran?
I didn't say that. I said people could go away with that impression the way that you were leveling down.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, did I give that impression that people would...
I mean, that's how it depends how you express yourself. Right?
Yeah, so I could accept that I might not have expressed myself, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to express myself. First of all, coming to Hadith al-Thaqalain, as I was just mentioning, like, there is something called tawatur, right? With multiple chains of transmission. So that is sorted out, right? So that shouldn't be thrown out. That's number one. Number two, as far as like Quran and Ahlul Bayt are concerned, that is different from Quran and Hadith, right? So what Hadith al-Thaqalain says is like, you should stick to Quran and Ahlul Bayt, which we all do, but it doesn't say that you stick to Quran and Hadith. That's number two. Number three, Hasbuna Kitabullah, the only Quran is sufficient. That's not something anyone would abide by. Neither Sunni nor Shi'ites, right? And that's not what I want to say. And for that reason, I was categorically clear that there are opinions about like, either you take it or throw it. And I'm not saying with that. Right? So taking or throwing it, like taking it something which everyone would say like, wholeheartedly everything would be accepted. That's not I would subscribe to because of the issues which I just highlighted, right? Throwing it out, I don't subscribe to either because of Hasbuna Kitabullah and its excellent source and a pool of references which we should be taking. What I was advocating is to work with it. What I mean by working with it is to engage with it in a critical sense. Not to accept wholeheartedly, not to reject wholeheartedly, right? So that's where we go. Now when it comes to marja and like, ulama, that wasn't a point of discussion at all, right? I never said like, scholars have not done, they're hiding their research because I'm sitting on their research, right? I'm benefiting from what they have said, likes of Marum Shushtari, likes of Ayatollah Khouy and their students whom, I met, I've studied. So by no means there is any reason whatsoever to belittle their research. Myself, I would consider part and parcel of the same tradition, right? I don't consider myself to be alienated, aloof from that. And these things are debated and discussed, right, within the tradition. And that's what it is about, right? So the point which should be noted is, let's work with it. When we receive something on WhatsApp, let's not think that's the utterance of the Imam because of the issues we highlighted. Right? Thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify myself. Otherwise, I would have left this session with, some tension, like, whether I have created chaos in the community and I have misguided someone. That was not the intention. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. Alaikum salam.
So my question is about Ilm al-Rijal. So from my understanding is Ilm al-Rijal, the Sunnis built a lot on it, but there is, on the Shia, there is lots of discussion about it. So, and the thing also with the Shia is they care about taking hadith against Quran, and anything that's against Quran, they won't consider anything with the Quran, they would follow it. So what are other things that they would look at in hadith, Ilm al-Rijal, looking at Quran? Because in terms of looking at the authenticity of the hadith, there are also some rules that they would follow rigorously to assess and evaluate all hadith. So it's not like haphazardly, okay, there is biases in hadith, but there is also a very rigorous methodological way to assess hadith as well, and trying to get the best out of them, which I didn't feel that was that wasn't discussed much as well on the lecture, which I don't know if you can just highlight a bit on it, please.
Impressive. I'm really impressed by the level of questions which I'm receiving. So thank you so much for bringing all these beautiful points of conversations. So first of all, there were a couple of things. So I would start with Sunni versus Shia hadith literature, because that's an excellent historical things to be kept in mind. As far as Sunni hadith literature is concerned, predominantly it came through oral transmission, whereas Shia hadith literature predominantly came to us through written tradition. Why is that? Number one, Shiites were in minority, right? When there is a minority, you would have less people transmitting your material to some other, right? As far as Sunni literature is concerned, they had halaqat of lectures where one person would be lecturing to thousands of people. Among these thousands, hundreds of other people would be transmitting to other people, right? So you have that tradition. Whereas Shiites, because of minority, that's number one. Number two, Imams were encouraging, because of their minority status and having this in Taqiyya and other sources, which we may want to unpack at some later stage. The strategy which was adopted by the Imams was writing, because when you write, you could easily transmit to different places and in hiding as well. Number three, Shiite communities were spread. Imams were in Medina, companions were in Kufa, and the compilers were in Qom, right? And later on to Baghdad as well. So because of the geographical, expansion, the best strategy which Imams would have come up with is, write your stuff and transmit it to other people, right? So that was and for that reason, we have less, we have less Ilm al-Rijal, as you highlighted, rightfully highlighted, but equally important, if not more, is Ilm al-Faharis. So we don't have first books written on Rijal. We have first books written on Ilm al-Fahris, right? So, for example, Najashi, he wrote a book on Fahris. Sheikh Tusi, he wrote a book on Fahris. So what is Fahris? Fahris is this: scholars would come and say like, this particular companions of Imam has written this books. So I took the name of Haris bin Abdullah Sijistani. He has book on Kitab Salaat, right? So all these narrations what we have on rituals and like, in Salat, that is transmitted from his book. Ubaidullah bin Ali al-Halabi, he has an excellent book. Muhammad bin Ali al-Halabi has book on Kitab al-Masail, right? So all these books which were written were transmitted in successive generation. So occasionally Sunnis would come and say like, you won't have ilmul rijal, but you tend to neglect ilmul faharis. And the reason why we have ilmul faharis, not ilmul rijal, because we had our material transmitted to us through written tradition, not oral tradition. So that's a fundamental discussion and the differences when it comes to this, right? Strong or not strong, that is something which both the methods should be taken into scrutiny, but less issues as far as like, forgery is concerned. But you would be indulging in issues of orthographical error, because when it's written and you don't write with like, the orthographical issues would be there. So that's why I say like, we should be cautious as far as like, strong, the word strong is concerned. So that's first part of your question. Second part of your question about like, rigorous methodology. When I was preparing for this lecture, the analogy which came to my mind is like English language, or for that reason, for that matter, any language. Would grammar come first, or language would be the first thing which would come as far as the method is concerned? People would start writing about books of grammar first or books of language first? Of course, grammar would be later, right? Because people might be speaking and they would speak. Later on, someone would think like, let's formulate it. Let's observe how people are like, having their conversations and take rules out of it, right? And then you would make grammar out of it. And then when you won't see anything fitting, you would say, this is exception. Yeah, we always say this doesn't fall in a rule, so let's make it exception. The same thing would happen with the hadith as well. So hadith as a pool of literature, as a pool of like, resources, that was there. Grading it in terms of like sahih, da'if, muwaththaq, hasan, all this gradation of hadith, that comes later. Right? So a person who is like, who wants to research, they would say the point of research should be from hadith, not from the other way around, from the gradation. Because by doing so, if you start from gradation of hadith, you would be missing what was happening in the early stage. In the same manner, if I start reading grammar books, what would happen? I would be speaking like, a language which people on the street won't understand necessarily. Because it's like, this is not what we speak. We speak in a different language, right? So by referring to grammar books, in the first instance, I would be missing the beauty of the language which is spoken in day-to-day lives. In the same manner, if we start our approach from gradation of hadith, we would be missing what was happening in the early stage. So just to give you a context, the gradation of hadith started in Hilla, which I was just discussing about the Hilla period, right? Radiuddin ibn Tawus was the scholar who started grading this hadith. And that was partially under the influence of Sunnis, because Sunnis were bombarding that you have like bunch of literature and you don't know what is right and wrong, whereas we have this gradation of hadith. And then Shia scholar would come and say like, we have gradation of hadith, but with our own parameters, our own way of looking and our own approaches, right? So it was a device, it was formulated, but that was later. So it didn't come in my lecture because I wanted to focus and divert what was happening in the early period. But thank you for bringing this, and that is something worth taking into consideration.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we do have to end there. I know there are a couple of other questions that are there, but inshallah, Shaykh Kumail's around for a little bit afterwards, but not too long. So please feel free to reach out to him. Please, thank you very much. So Salaat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala
Please do look at our future talks in the coming weeks. You can see all of the talks on the screen. We also have community breakfast this Sunday. Please do attend. Please do participate at 10 o'clock here.